Hello and welcome. I'm Carol Cram, host of the Art and Fiction podcast. This episode features Ferdia Lennon, author of Glorious Exploits, listed in the theatre category on Art and Fiction. Ferdia Lennon was born and raised in Dublin. He holds a BA in History and Classics from University College Dublin and an MA in Prose Fiction from the University of East Anglia. Glorious Exploits is his first novel. A Sunday Times bestseller, it was broadcast on BBC Radio 4 as a book at bedtime and was the winner of the Waterstones Debut Fiction Prize 2024. After spending many years in Paris, Ferdia now lives in Norwich with his wife and son. Welcome to the Art and Fiction podcast, Ferdia.
Thank you so much, Carol, for having me.
I have to say, I was absolutely blown away by Glorious Exploits. It's one of the most original novels I've read in a long time. I actually listened to the audiobook while I was traveling through Greece and touring various Greek ruins a few weeks ago. So that was a really cool experience, since your novel brings the ancient times to life. So tell us about the genesis of Glorious Exploits.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And really lovely to hear that you listened to the book while traveling around Greece. That feels almost like perfect way.
It really was. Yeah.
So the genesis for Glorious Exploits, it comes in a few ways. I've always, ever since I was a child, I've been fascinated by ancient Greece. I was, one of those kids who would memorize the Greek myths or the various attributes and backstories of the Greek gods and, asked to be tested on them. I studied classical studies in university, history and classics, and I always wanted to write something set in the period, but I wasn't sure what that would be. Then I read, two books. I read Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, which, about the 27-year conflict between Athens and Sparta that spills all across the Greek world. And in that, there is, at the heart of that story, I've heard it described as almost, you could see it as this, story of a war, but in another sense, it almost reads like a Greek tragedy about the fall of Athens. And at the heart of that tragedy is the Sicilian expedition, where Athens presents something as this kind of humanitarian intervention, whereas behind the scenes, they very much had dreams of conquest, defeating Syracuse, which was the largest city-state, and then moving across the island. And things did not go to plan, to say the least. They were completely defeated, and thousands of Athenian prisoners, so many prisoners, in fact, that they couldn't fit them in a prison. They had to put them in a quarry outside of the city of Syracuse that you can visit today. So that really stuck in my imagination, but I didn't know what my angle on this would be until a year or so later. I read Plutarch's Life of Nicias, and in it, Nicias dies. He's one of the main Athenian generals in Syracuse, in Sicily. He describes how some of these Athenian prisoners who were left in this quarry to die actually survived by quoting lines from Euripedes' plays.
It's amazing.
There is a real historical core behind this, even behind the idea of the plays and, art to survive. And when I read that, this quite diffuse idea of something set in that period became very focused, and I knew what the book would be.
But isn't that wonderful as an historical novelist? And I know this is your first novel, hopefully the first of many. When you find something like that, like two things that just kind of come together, because what an amazing idea, the concept of these guys quoting Greek, to survive. And then, you get your two lads that come and put on the plays. So the novel touches on so many themes, but I want to talk about the theme of friendship, Lampo and Gellon. So how is the novel a story about friendship?
Yeah, so that's well observed. I think it's a story of art, the fallout of war, theater, but in many ways at the heart of it, there's this friendship between Lampo and Gellon. They're two potters, but their pottery factory has closed during the war, so they're slightly at a loose end. They're best friends, but in that way, they've been best friends since childhood. And I think often when people have been almost like family, best friends since childhood, you can actually be really close friends with someone that if you met them as an adult, you wouldn't necessarily even hit it off. But because those bonds are forged at such a young age, you kind of see past the differences
Yeah.
and you can love the person. So that's the kind of relationship between this somewhat of an odd couple. Lampo is a little bit of a layabout. He's always cracking a joke. He sees things. He's trying to make light of everything. And he's not very ambitious. He lives with his mom. He's kind of in his
Yeah.
third. He lives at home with his mom. And Gelon is the opposite. He's a much more kind of melancholy, earnest, poetic, passionate individual. And he is the driving force. He is the one who gets it into his head. So during this war between Athens and Syracuse, the cultural connection has been severed. So there have been no more Athenian plays, and more specifically, no more Euripedes plays. And he thinks that Athens, which is in a very bad situation, is probably going to lose the war. And if that happens, there's a good chance that Sparta or Syracuse might essentially just raze the city to the ground. So by gathering these
Mhm.
lines from these plays, they might actually be rescuing them from oblivion. Whereas Lampo kind of thinks that this will be a bit of a laugh.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah, he doesn't really get the big picture at all. He just kind of goes along with stuff. Chris Lampo was a wonderful character. I loved him. We'll talk more about him in a minute. I wanted to talk about the theater. I actually have a background in theater, so to read a novel that is about Greek theater was amazing. I actually went to Epidaurus while I was in Greece and saw the
Oh,
big theater. So, and then I was listening to the novel on that day when we went to Epidaurus, so that was pretty amazing. Yeah, it was. So what is your background in theater?
to be honest, I don't even have one. I love theater. I love plays, going to see plays. I love cinema. Ever since I was a kid,
Mhm.
that was my entryway into theater in a way, was cinema,
Yeah.
kind of modified version of theater. I lived in Paris for quite a few years, and I did have some good friends who ran an amateur theater company, which was called the Montmartre Dionysia. So actually, that's kind of
Oh, wow.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
so cool.
So I think yeah, that probably even a way those amateur theatrics might have played a little bit of an influence, even if I wasn't acting. I was kind
Yeah.
of helping in various ways, or there, along for the ride. But yeah, I love narrative basically in all its forms, whether it's novels, poetry, plays, cinema. There is something very, I suppose, special about the collaborative nature of theater and the live nature of theater. That kind of ephemeral, it's each performance is different and cannot quite be recaptured in the same way. And also the sense that theater back then, when my novel is set, was the popular mass entertainment. These were the blockbusters of ancient Greek society. This was your Marvel, this was your Scorsese, this was everything kind of mixed in, and thousands, like the whole community would kind of show up to
Yeah.
watch those plays. So I wanted to convey that sense of the immediacy and the kind of fundamental part that theater still important, but like then it was essentially epic poetry and theater. If they're
Well,
really
yeah, I mean, it really speaks to the fact that humans want stories, and that was their form of storytelling, of course, was the theater. And
absolutely.
I was wondering how you did your research about how they put theater on. Like you've got the masks, you've got the costumes, you've got the whole chorus bit, like it is Greek theater. So how did you do some research about that?
Yeah, it was like a mix of reading almost like academic nonfiction books
Mm,
about ancient Greek theater and the structures, from everything from what the masks were made of, how the chorus would, the orchestra that the chorus would be in, and the Deus Ex Machina, how that would kind of often
yeah,
function. So just a lot of those practical details that you want to get right. Of course, my play doesn't take place in a theater, it's in a quarry.
yes.
Their resources are going to be very different or limited in comparison. I traveled around Greece. I went to Athens, saw the original theater where those plays would have first been put on.
The
I,
Theater of Dionysus, is that what it is? At
that's
the
it.
Acropolis?
Yeah, it's
Yep,
right
I
by the
was there.
Acropolis.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. It's a
pretty
it's
cool.
it's surreal to think that that's the first production of Medea, of Oedipus the King. Yeah, I found that amazing. And what else did I do? I did loads of things. Lots and lots of books. I read basically every play, every ancient Greek play that I could get my hands on, all the
Yeah,
tragedies, all the comedies, to get a sense of it. I went to Syracuse. I visited the theater in Syracuse, the Greek theater in Syracuse,
yeah,
which really strangely is so close to where the quarry was. So, the where the theater would be is like maybe a 6 or 7 minute walk from where thousands of these prisoners were left to die, which is in itself is maybe a 20-minute walk from the city center of Syracuse. So there was a real juxtaposition of like urban people's everyday lives, the theater, and essentially a concentration camp. I'm sure you know this yourself. It's sometimes you can't really replicate. It isn't always possible. I had to do a lot of this research on a shoestring in bits and pieces,
yeah.
but there can be a real value sometimes in actually going to see the place.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've all my novels are set in Europe, and I try to travel there as much as I can. And no, you have to kind of get the just the atmosphere, what the air smells like. Obviously things have changed a lot, but yeah, there's something about just being there. But yeah, it is a bit challenging. It's expensive.
Yeah.
So why Euripides? Medea and the Trojan Women were the two plays. So why did you choose those two? Is that because they actually did Euripides in the story, or?
So we don't know what place that we know it was. Yeah, exactly. It's because Euripides. So the Syracuse and Sicilians were particularly obsessed, apparently, with Euripides. So it wasn't just any, Athenian drama. If you came out with some Aeschylus, they were like, no, get back
Eh,
into it. Next. So that was the reason why it had to be Euripides. What Medea, I feel, was the first. It's probably his most famous play
yeah,
and iconic, and there were thematic things that I felt it made sense for the book and for these
yeah,
characters. Trojan Women even had more thematic resonances. It's about what happens to the victims of the Trojan. It basically completely turns the Trojan War, the Iliad, on its head and changes it from this celebration. I mean, Homer is more interesting than just a pure celebration, but there's definitely that aspect, militaristic, male conquest and valor is held up in high regard, and then you
yeah.
reframe that from slaves, be it women and children, just the devastation. And I don't think there's anything else really like that. It's quite unusual in ancient Greek theater,
Yes.
and what is really interesting is that that play was performed the summer before the invasion of Sicily. So that would have actually been the last play. That was the last Euripides play that was performed before the invasion. So it was this strange synchronicity of it made the most sense thematically, but it also historically would have been the latest play. The way that theater worked there is that you might have had professional actors in the main role, but for the chorus and various other parts, you would just have people in the citizen body chosen by lot. So there's a high chance, high probability that some of those prisoners in this quarry would have actually acted in Trojan Women. Yeah, which I really liked.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. That I thought, why were soldiers so able to quote Euripides? But then also, I guess that speaks to how important theater was in their lives, when they were in Athens.
And it's an oral kind of storytelling tradition.
Yeah.
People are carrying these poems around in their mind, or yeah, it's a very different way. There's no iPhone.
I know, isn't that wonderful? That again, you really brought that out that they would have these in their mind, even though they've been through so much, they could still remember. And every so often they'd have to make lines up, right? Well, because they'd forgotten them. You mentioned
Exactly.
that at some point, so that was quite realistic. So I wanted to talk about the voice of Lampo. I just loved him. He's very modern. It totally works. So Lampo and Gallon are basically lads from Dublin. And so why did you decide to make them kind of modern in a way, but set in the time?
Yeah, thanks. So the decision for that, part of the inspiration was actually reading Aristophanes' comedies.
Right.
And they're the only plays that we have from 5th century Athens that are actually about the ordinary people
Yeah.
and contemporary. They're not set in a distant mythic past or a long historical past. They're set in contemporary Athens. And what you'll see from modern translations is translators will use slang, their body, they're wild, they feel contemporary. I think they just understand if they want to convey that,
Yeah.
they can't use the kind of more formal structures that you typically find in the tragedies. So that was the inspiration. Also, if I had them sound like 19th century posh English people from Downton Abbey, I think automatically you'd be like, oh, yeah, that's a good choice. They would have sounded like, Boris Johnson or whatever. But
Hopefully not.
yeah, hopefully not. But in a way, that makes actually no more sense. So that you're always it's like a translation when you're writing historical fiction, unless
Yeah.
you're writing something in the recent past where you can literally replicate it. But if you go quite far back, anything more than 400 years or 500 years, you'll start to see that writers have to make a decision about what version of English they're going to use. The Irish Hiberno English for me made sense. I'm from Dublin. It was a
Yeah.
natural way of story. But also Syracuse and Sicily is this island. It's part of the Greek world, but not part of the Greek world. It's an insider outsider. And Ireland was part of the British Empire historically, not
Yeah.
anymore, but was also an outsider. It was in, but it wasn't in. And you had the native, old Irish playing underneath the version of English that we spoke, which gives some of those idiosyncrasies to Hiberno English. So I thought you kind of create those post-colonial resonances
Yeah.
in a way that's not heavy-handed, feels quite natural. And I think hopefully gives you a sense that this ancient Greek world isn't some kind of monoculture
Yeah.
of one type of person, you know?
Well, actually, you bring that in a lot because one thing I really noticed about the novel is how much ancient Greece was really large. Like you mentioned the tin mines, which would be up in Cornwall or in
Yeah.
Ireland or wherever they were, and that people came from all over. Like Lyra, where did Lyra actually come from? I could never
So she's
remember that. The slave. Pardon
yeah,
me?
she's Lydia. So
Lydia.
Lydia, kind of like modern day Turkey, Sardis,
Okay,
like
that's where that was. I actually didn't look that up, so I wasn't sure where Lydia was. So she was from Turkey. But yeah, so what you brought out in the novel is how big the ancient world was. I think we forget that it was a lot bigger. It wasn't just Athens, that they traded right up to England, which is something I found out when I was in Greece. I didn't realize that the Mycenaeans were actually in England, or they traded to
yeah,
England anyway, which
it's amazing.
wow, didn't know that. So yeah, that was interesting that it's a bigger world, and I love that idea that there's Athens, and then there's that idea of Syracuse being like Ireland.
Yeah,
So
kind of on the periphery.
yeah, yeah, and they were, yeah. And I've got to talk to you about your writing itself. You are a really good writer. And
Thank you.
well, one of the things I really enjoyed about the novel was your use of similes. Many times I'd be listening away and I would actually gasp out loud because you had such apt similes or a turn of phrase. And I was off, of course, as a writer, I'm like, darn, I wish I thought of that. So do these like come to you as you write, or is it during the editing process? Your world is so visceral, it's so tactile and just so beautifully rendered.
Well, that this is tell me more, tell me more.
Yeah, right. I know that every writer likes to hear that. No, but I mean, you really got the knack. You're just really good at the use of your similes are excellent. So I was just wondering how you kind of come up with it. I know it's almost impossible to answer, but just speak to it a bit.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think in one way, what I tried to do with this novel, it's written in a first person narrative from the perspective of Lampo. So when
Yeah,
it's going well, you're in that character's mind. So you start to use similes or ways of seeing, almost like method acting, or that's maybe a metaphor that comparison that I would use. It's not that I was running around thinking that I was Lampo, but in a way, you're kind of tricking yourself. You're kind of getting lost. I think often writing is at its best, when it's real and vivid for yourself, is a lot more of a likelihood that you will create those effects for the reader. So part of that is getting into like a flow state, getting into the mind of the character, understanding who that character is. And then, as you say, in the editing process, you might come back and that's where you can fix things where maybe it wasn't as seamless or a description isn't as vivid as it could be. It isn't as evocative
Yeah.
as it could be. So it's that blend of intuition and then afterwards going back with a kind of, a red pen.
The
Um,
red pen, yes. It's a lot of it is done in the editing process. I
Absolutely.
think, yeah, because you really get into Lampo's head and you're seeing the world. Like Lampo smells the world and sees the world and feels it. It's very tactile. It's one of the most tactile novels I've read in a long time. I was really well done. So the novel's really about Lampo's growth, isn't it? About he's a bit of a ne'er-do-well, as we talked about earlier, with his mom, and he sort of finally steps up and takes responsibility. So tell us how you developed Lampo.
How did I develop them? In one way, I remember I sat down and I was trying to write the novel and I had the first line. So Gelon says to me, let's go down and feed the Athenians. The weather's
Yeah,
perfect for feeding the
great
Athenians.
first line.
Cheers. But it was very useful for me because I suddenly I knew who this guy was rather than being some, quite distant figure in a, Greek cloak, impenetrable. It was like someone I grew up with in Dublin. I could understand that psychology. So in a way, it was just following that. It's not that he's based on any specific person, but that where I grew up definitely informed it, but through a lot of historical research as well. So how did I develop him? I think it's yeah. It was for me. It was always people describe the novel as quite comedic, and where I would see it as a tragedy comedy. It's hopefully
Yeah,
funny, but also quite sad and a blend. My favorite type of comedy would be comedy that comes from character, where you're never
yes.
breaking the plausibility, psychological plausibility in service of a quick gag. So for me, understanding who he was and the decisions he made had to be consistent rather than, oh, it would be great if they do this. If I could get them
Yeah.
to do that, it has to come from, yes, I guess was psychological realism and knowing the character, which is a lot of thinking, sitting with it, and writing and rewriting.
Just writing and rewriting and just getting into his head. Yes, because the world sort of slowly unfolds in front of him in a way, and it gets deeper and deeper as he learns more and more the sort of nuances of life. I really found that he's a great character, and of course the voice. I have to talk about your audio book. So you actually narrated it, didn't you? Which
Yeah,
is
yeah.
amazing. How did you do that? Are you do you haven't, well, you said you don't have an acting background, but it was unbelievable how you did that.
Oh, well, that's really lovely to hear that because you're always nervous about why did I do that? Really like audiobooks.
Yeah, me too.
Actually, they're a wonderful way of just, you know, reading in moments where you otherwise wouldn't be able to read.
Yeah.
And I started listening to audiobooks when I was commuting in Paris. I was teaching. I had 2 hour round trip, and the rush hour metro was so packed that you couldn't actually read a book. So I started to listen to audiobooks. Would listen to an audiobook a week basically just on my commute.
Yeah.
And in the back of my head, I was like, this is a wonderful way to experience. I read my books, but this is a wonderful way to experience a story or literature. Then I remember listening to an audiobook or a part of an audiobook by an Irish writer, and the actor was like, well, they got an English actor in to do it, which is fine if they can do the Irish accent, but this person
Yeah.
couldn't. And I was like, okay, this is something I want to do it if I can do it well. Oh, I don't want to force myself on I want to do what's best for the book. So I had to audition to
Oh,
do my,
really?
yeah, yeah. They had me read a sample chapter and it was all, all okay. But yeah, fun experience. Really, it was tiring, because you're in there for like 5 or 6 hours a day just speaking.
Yes. How
Um,
long did it take?
Took about 3 days.
Yeah. I thought it would be longer. But anyway, it was amazing. You really got all the voices, especially, of course, Lampo. But in fact, when you're talking, I can sometimes hear Lampo, and it's really fun. So, what are some parallels between Glorious Exploits and our own time? It actually felt very contemporary.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's very interesting if you read the ancient Greek plays, the comedies, the tragedies, Thucydides,
Hmm.
is strange juxtaposition of the deeply alien kind of world of ancient Greece where, yeah, sure, they have democracy, but only for adult male citizens. Um,
Exactly.
yeah, like half the population are probably enslaved, and yet still comparatively to most of, history, certainly like from 1,000 years before, you do have some form of like civic duty. You have public debates, you have elections, you have art, you have theater, you have epic poetry, singing costs. There are a huge amount of parallels. Also, what I found reading, so let's say stuff set in the Middle Ages, the degree to which thought is constantly just imbued with religious explanations for
Yeah.
things in a way that isn't as consistent at all in ancient Greece. Because in ancient Greece, you had people who were deeply religious, you had people who were skeptics, and you had people who were atheists. And that mix creates a kind of almost secular humanism mixed with religion, something that's a lot more closer to our own society, where
Yeah, I hadn't
you
thought about that. That's true. Yeah. It wasn't
um
so all-consuming because I write in the Middle Ages sometimes, and it is so much part of their worldview. Like everybody, there would be nobody who wasn't, part of it, pretty much. So yeah, I haven't thought about that. There would be a kind of a secular nature as well to ancient Greece. Is
completely like that. I think
Yeah,
that's one of the big ones. When I read to like I read the history of the Angles and the Saxons by the Honorable Bede, in history, and then you compare that with Thucydides, and just Thucydides feels so much more contemporary, despite being thousands of
isn't
years
that
later.
interesting? I haven't read Thucydides for quite a long time. So this would be a good opportunity. Would you like to do a short reading from Glorious Exploits?
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. So I feel like maybe a good one would be something, there's lots of theater in the book, but this section is where Lampo and Gelon go to the main theater shop or the only theater shop in Syracuse to try to get costumes and masks for their theatrical production.
Oh, good. I love that scene. Yeah.
So I'll just do a little short reading. Chapter 8. There's only one theatre shop in Syracuse. Not really open to the public, but Electo, your one who owns it, lets us in on account of an old friendship with my man. The shop was her husband's, and they ran it together until one day he disappeared. This was about 20 years ago, and I was just a kid at the time. There's been no sight nor sound of him ever since. All sorts of rumours abound. But my favourite is that she killed him and used his skin to make props for the plays. And yet, this isn't even the strangest thing about Electo. The strangest thing is that she kept the shop. There were three other costume makers in Syracuse when her husband disappeared, and the owner of each offered to buy Electo out, or even better, marry her. She was a stunner in her day, but to both proposals, business and matrimonial, she said, no thanks. It was her shop and she'd run it, and besides, she believed her husband would return someday, and what then? Though I've heard that when she said this, there was a curious lilt in her voice. Anyway, she kept her shop and never remarried. Within a couple of years, Electo was seen as the best option when it came to fashioning all things theatrical. In 10, it was the only option. She'd driven the others out of business. I knock a couple of times, but then Gellon pushes and the door swings open. This house is a sprawler, 4 stories including the cellar, yet it seems even bigger on account of all the theatrical gear. You can't see the real walls because they're covered with scene paintings from different plays. To my right must be Olympus, rolling clouds and gorgeous sunbeams thick and gold as honey. To the left are the battlements, some citadel, probably Troy, blood streaks on the lime-washed brick like gashes in pale skin, and tiny arches in the towers. It's so well done. I'm almost nervous walking past it. Like if I don't leg it, I'll go the way of Achilles. Straight ahead is the best scene of all. Hades. The river Styx to be exact. The water green and trembling, with faces and limbs rising. It reminds me of those statues at Victory Gate, but it's more beautiful than them. The light on the water is different from any I've ever seen in this world, yet it seems I know it. Gelon says that's what the best plays do. If they're true enough, you'll recognize it, even if it all seems mad at first. And this is why we give a shit about Troy, that for all we know, it was just some dream of Homer's. And I walk towards this green soul river, and for a moment, it's like I'm going home.
Wow, thank you. So that's theater in a nutshell, isn't it? And storytelling in a nutshell. It might seem all mad, but there is truth in there. That's
Yeah,
really
absolutely.
well done. Yeah, yeah, that's great. Really, really love that. So, Glorious Exploits is your first novel. So, what was your publication journey like? It's done very well, hasn't it? Rightly so.
I feel very fortunate now in how it's gone. Absolutely. You never know. Yeah. I mean, you realize just that, it's so many great books get out there. And
Yeah.
you need a bit of good fortune, I think, in finding a book, finding its way and finding its audience. It took a long time to write. So what was tricky about it was the process of writing it, researching it, working different jobs. So that was a long process. When I finished it, it was smooth enough then. Not easy. I didn't have an agent or anything. I sent it out. I waited it was a couple of months probably of having it out, and I got an agent. And then there was maybe, yeah, so that process, I've been writing for years though, as well.
Yeah.
So in one level, it's one of those things that seems quite happened quite quickly, but there was years and years before that.
Yeah. An
Um,
overnight success. Yes. No such thing.
yeah, so then it's just I'm trying to think of the process of I've been writing for many years. I studied, I began an early version of this novel years and years ago on a
Mhm.
writing program in England. And there, I kind of wrote about it once for an essay where, I brought it in the workshop environment. And it was just one of those things where one student looked very annoyed and they were just basically like, why do these characters sound Irish? This is just no, this doesn't work. Which is I think is so that's an interesting one in that like I think no book is gonna be for everyone. So I think it's very important to have your own aesthetic and try to have a bit of faith in what you're doing and
It's
accept the fact that it's not going to be for everyone.
exactly. Yeah, you cannot please everybody because eventually everybody gets that 1-star review, which is a killer, but you have to learn to ignore it for sure.
Completely. I mean, I find I think Goodreads is a wonderful thing for readers. It's a great thing for people to share books and recommend and respond, etc. Probably not the best place for writers to be hanging
No,
out.
never
Uh,
go to Goodreads. I know I don't ever look at my reviews on Goodreads. There's
But
always somebody.
yeah, exactly. But what is interesting is you can look at your favorite novel, your favorite writer,
Yeah,
and you will see plenty of 1-star reviews. Some of them even seem credible. They might seem actually quite articulate, other than the book and how great it is. So it's yeah, the world's it's many many people, and yeah, you just have to hopefully write something that you believe in as best you can, and hopefully find an audience for it.
so one of my goals with the Art and Fiction podcast is to inspire other authors. So what's one thing you've learned from writing your novel that you didn't know before?
I think there's a few. One thing that I've learned for writers that I didn't know before. I think what's useful to me is that I actually set this book aside for a few years because I got stuck and I was
Yeah,
really stuck with the book and didn't see a way forward. So it's very useful to me now realizing that you can actually be completely stuck in a book and not know how to, have just been like, I can't do this. And then you can actually come back to that. The work isn't lost. Leave it,
no,
save everything you work, keep it in a file, and you can come back to it. And you might a year, 6 months, a month. In my case, it was actually a couple of years,
yeah,
return to it and suddenly understand how to
yeah,
do it. So that is very, very useful because you understand in an experiential way. It's not just as simple as writing. Writing isn't easy. Some stories
no.
will be easier than others, but writing it's hard work. It
It's
is.
extremely hard work. Yeah, that's very good advice because it is true. I've done that myself. I've set things aside and then come back. And I feel like I'm a failure because I can't get through. But actually, it's just got to sit there back over somewhere. And then 5 years later, you come and pick it up. So yeah, don't despair. Nothing is ever lost. I'm actually kind of in the middle of that right now with a novel. But it's taking forever, but that's just the process. We all love this idea that you could sit down like in the movies and you write a novel and it's done and you're famous. But no, it unfortunately doesn't work that way. It's a painful process, isn't it?
That's it. It's hard graft, it is.
It is. I love hard graft. So what are you working on now, if you'd like to share?
Yeah, so I'm working on my second novel. It's set in 14th century France. Um,
Yay, that's my period.
oh, amazing. That's right.
Well,
Yeah, it is.
my first novel was set in 14th century Italy,
Yeah, yeah.
and the one right now is also 14th century Italy. It's not finished yet, but
Such an
it's a great period.
Italy.
So, where in
Yeah.
France? In Paris?
A little bit in Paris and then in the north, kind of Picardy region during the Hundred
Yeah.
Years' War.
Oh, 100
Um,
Years War. Great.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's yeah, kind of a little bit more of in some ways, a kind of more detective medieval, you know, but with, grounded very much in kind of historical, yeah, in the period, steeped in the period, but hopefully a bit different as well. So yeah, working away on that, and yeah, just and as we were talking about in the research process, I think the key is to set your novels in beautiful places,
Yes.
and then have to go and investigate.
Yeah, you're lucky. At least you're close to France. For me, it's a bit of a trek to get over to Italy, but
That's such a lovely, like Italy, and France is amazing, but Italy is so incredible too. What a place to, and what a period, because they were very much ahead of the game, weren't they, the Italians in that
yeah.
period? Yeah,
So my novel's about a lot about the arts and art, visual art in particular. So the current one's
yeah,
actually set in Siena. And of course, as you know, like when you're writing, you're back in Siena or wherever your novel's set, and you can sort of see it and feel it. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. I think that's why we like to do it. We just like to go to cool places and in our imagination.
yeah.
So thank you so much, Ferdia. I really enjoyed talking with you. I was really looking forward to this interview because, as I said, I really liked your novel. So I really appreciate you coming in.
Thank you so much, Carol. This was a real pleasure. I had a great time chatting with you.
Thank you.
I've been speaking with Ferdia Lennon, author of Glorious Exploits, listed in the theatre category on Art and Fiction at www.artandfiction.com. Be sure to check the show notes for a link to Ferdia's website at www.ferdialennon.com. You'll also find a link to a 20% discount on a subscription to Pro Writing Aid, a fantastic editing tool for writers. If you are enjoying the Art and Fiction podcast, please help us keep the lights on by making a donation to the Ko-fi website. The link is in the show notes. Also, please follow Art and Fiction on Facebook, and don't forget to give the Art and Fiction podcast a positive review or rating wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much for listening.